And closing this panel, we have Mr. Mark Klugmann. He worked for the White House during the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George Bush the First. And he has advised six national governments, and he currently works for the Honduran government in a very interesting project that he's going to tell us now, and which probably will give us a new approach to what leading by example means.
Thank you very much, Federico. It's a pleasure to be here. From Honduras, I've actually already been in communication with Milan, because there are people who are looking at the Expo 2015 event and seeing ways to apply some of these concepts of leap zones here in Italy. And I think there are some interesting opportunities for Europe, and I think Italy can be a leader in this regard. With the Free Market Roadshow, when we were in other cities, which I'll discuss, we see an interesting exchange of ideas taking place through the roadshow. It's very interesting for me that in the year 2014, with all of the information technology, that I'm finding one of the most effective ways of moving information is by having people pack suitcases and get on planes and trains and meeting face to face. It's not something that's replaceable. Now, can Honduras offer an idea that would be useful in Europe? And the answer is, do we have examples of this? Jose Piñera, who was in the roadshow in some of the other cities, in Paris and in Madrid, designed a pension reform in a small, very distant country of Chile, which became the basis for reforms done in many other countries, a few dozen countries at this point. About 17 years ago, Jose Piñera and I were invited to testify before a committee of the United States Senate. The United States, a rather large country, was trying to deal with its problems of pensions and Social Security, and it thought that what was being done in Chile might be useful. A very small place is Hong Kong. I would argue that Hong Kong, through its example, explains much of the prosperity of East Asia, including the process that permitted the largest country in population to become the fastest growing economy in the world. You can't really figure out that turn of events without understanding it begins with Hong Kong. So in fact, it's quite obvious that small countries, through examples, can be very powerful. Indeed, I would make the argument and published an article to this effect about 20 years ago, that policy innovation is more likely to come from small countries rather than large countries. Now, 50 years ago, if we were meeting and we were talking about Hong Kong and it's an example, the more obvious question would have been, well, yeah, but is it a buy or is it a sell? Is it going to survive, or is it time to cash out your chips and go home? And I would have gotten it wrong. 50 years ago, I would have said, well, Hong Kong, as we know it, is not going to survive. I see England collapsing into European socialism. It's going to become the sick man of Europe. I would have been right if I'd made that prediction. It's withdrawing from its international obligations, its empire. That's from the past. It's not projecting power around the world. That was certainly true. And we might have said in China, what if China goes into a frenzy of Maoist insanity, and in fact 2 years later the Cultural Revolution would begin, and somewhere in excess of 5% of its population was killed by its own government. And I would have said 50 years ago, I said there's no way that Hong Kong could possibly survive if those two things in Britain and China happen at the same time, which they did, yet Hong Kong survived. So I was wrong. Which means I need to figure out, what did I misunderstand that I got that so wrong? And the simplified answer is a failure to appreciate just how durable enclaves are. And they're durable because it turns out they become extremely useful. They even become useful to those who we mistakenly think will eliminate them. Now, the example of Hong Kong inspired Taiwan and Singapore. Now, Singapore in my lifetime has gone from $600 per year of per capita income to $62,000 per year. If you look at this graph, that pink box in the middle is about 25 years ago. It's when Singapore, on a per capita income basis, basically converged with the 4 largest economies of Europe. At which point Singapore did not say, well, let's all just move to one speed and we'll just try and keep up with Europe. They just kept growing a lot faster. Singapore's a lot richer than Europe right now. Lee Kuan Yew is a British trained lawyer, and he understood the importance of rule of law. And so when he took his poor country to independence in 1965, instead of saying, well, let's try and build some credible institutions, which would be the obvious but mistaken path, he said, wait a minute, who already has a very credible judicial system? And he said he wanted the same one that Hong Kong had. So the Supreme Court of Hong Kong at that time was the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London. These are the law lords, they have wigs. So he said, that's my Supreme Court. So he would go and meet with investors and say, please send your money. And the investor would say, but your country is only 5 minutes old. And he said, yes, but we have a Supreme Court that's 500 years old. And the investors said, I like that. Now, in 1978, Deng Xiaoping, that's the shorter man in the photograph. The very tall man is Helmut Kohl, who was the German chancellor. And the smaller man is in height, not in stature, is Deng Xiaoping. So Deng Xiaoping becomes the ruler of Communist China in 1978, and he goes and spends a week with Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, essentially saying, you know, what do I do? Now what's interesting is both of these men, Helmut Kohl and Deng Xiaoping, had this extraordinary challenge and opportunity. Each one of them, about 10 years apart, had to deal with this question of how do you move an entire country and population from a socialist economy to a market economy. In the case of Deng Xiaoping, it was the eastern Länder of Germany. In the case of, that was the case of Helmut Kohl. In the case of Deng Xiaoping, it was 1 billion people in China. It was Deng Xiaoping's turn first, and what he did was to create very small zones. The first 4 were created in 1980. The most well-known is Shenzhen, which is next to Hong Kong. Now imagine if instead he'd said, no, I want to do the whole thing at once. And imagine if he'd appeared before the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party in 1980. And that would be you. And he says to you, starting tomorrow, each one of you must immediately give up control over whatever part of the national economy has been assigned to you. That would not have worked very well. At a minimum, he would have been pushed out of power. Quite likely, he would have been pushed out of a helicopter. We wouldn't know his name. Instead, what he did was to say, listen, all of you, just keep doing what you're doing. I'm just going to go over here far, far away from all of the things that matter to the rest of you in a place that's too small and too empty to fight over. And he created these tiny zones. Now, you know, at the meetings we go to, people say, oh, what we need is leadership. We need presidents who come in and say, this is what's going to be done, and they do it. You know, there's this secret admiration for not the ideology of his predecessor, Mao Zedong, but the secret admiration for the scope of vision, that you take on the whole thing, you know what needs to be done, and you do it. Now, Helmut Kohl did this as a civilized gentleman, not like Mao, but the essential idea of Helmut Kohl was to say to the Eastern Länder, I know what must be done, and I'm going to do it. And he did, and to this day, the poorest part of Germany is the East. It's a third poorer than the rest of the country. They live on subsidies and welfare. It's not obvious that it's value added to the national economy. And those seeking opportunity leave the East and go to the West. Whereas in China, the most dynamic part of the economy is the South, where these zones were created. They became the fastest growing economic spaces in the world. Now imagine if Helmut Kohl had decided he was going to do what he saw being done in China. What if he decided that his goal would be that the fastest growing spaces in the world would be tiny zones, perhaps in former Hanseatic cities in the north of East Germany, in areas too small and too empty to fight over? What if people throughout Europe seeking opportunity were rushing with capital and ideas and enterprise into these tiny spaces embedded in the Länder of East Germany? What then? It might have turned out differently for Germany, and it might have turned out differently for Europe. The mistake we make is usually a misunderstanding about the areas of land and the scale of things, and we fail to see how little land is really involved in the activities that we're acquainted with. That's the outline of a map of Africa, a very big place. You can see embedded in there the outline of a map of the United States, which looks small by comparison. Next to the east coast of the United States, you see in green embedded a map of Italy. Just above it, you see in blue Switzerland. If Singapore were there, it would be a single pixel. Singapore began life at 581 square kilometers. It became so rich it reclaimed land from the sea. It's a little over 700 now. 5 million people live there with a per capita income of $62,000. The city of Paris, the official city limits where 2 million people live, is just 100 square kilometers. Hong Kong, where 7 million people live, prosperously, is 1,100 square kilometers. Honduras, that has created a remarkable legislation, 1% of Honduras is big enough for one Hong Kong. The total population of Honduras is 8 million people. Hong Kong, it's 7 million people with lower population density than Paris. In reality, everyone in Honduras could live in 1% of the territory, and they could live as well as people in Hong Kong or Singapore. In Italy, one Hong Kong in territory would be 1/3 of 1% of Italy. I would describe that as an area too small and too empty to fight over. Now, Dr. Colombato very insightfully earlier today said, you know, a majority of the people actually, they prefer a nanny state. Well, that's probably true. So why be insistent in designing a reform plan that has to include or be imposed on those who don't agree? Why not have a special zone, and on the basis of self-selection, those who like that idea can choose that, and those who don't like that idea can just keep doing what they're doing. In the case of Shenzhen, there were 30,000 people living there. Today there are 11 or 12 million, all there voluntarily. And there was so much interest in that China today has over 100 special zones. They're not being, they're not being forced. People are seeking that. That's a map of Honduras. Honduras changed its constitution to create special legal, economic, administrative, political jurisdictions, something a lot like Hong Kong. And essentially any place in a department that borders the coast, if it's a low population density, those areas can be rezoned under this to form part of the special jurisdiction. That's a chair. It became clear that I was having trouble explaining what Honduras had done because people thought they understood, but they didn't. But because they thought they understood, they wouldn't really listen. And then I would hear them say, so it's like a free zone. And I'd say, well, no, it's a leap zone. And they'd say, so it's like a special economic zone. And I'd say, well, that's not really it. It's a leap zone. It's a legal, economic, administrative, political jurisdiction. And then I found the chair. Now everyone gets it very quickly. The chair has 4 legs. Let's use Hong Kong as an example. Suppose someone says, no, I just want a special economic zone. Well, that means we're going to have to remove one of the legs. Let's start with the political leg. If it's Hong Kong, let's see, the political leg means there's stable governance, there's rule of law, there's limited government, transparency. And you say, no, I just want a special economic zone. I just want to pay less taxes. So we eliminate this. Rule of law, forget about it, it's gone. Now we're down to 3 legs. And there's the administrative leg. That's executive efficiency, pro-competition, pro-growth. You don't have to pay bribes. It's not cronyism. You don't have to make the right campaign contributions or be business partners with somebody's cousin. And it's not about protecting the businesses that are already there. You can actually come in and compete. And you say, no, I'm not interested in that. I just want to pay less in taxes. So we eliminate that leg. Now we're down to two legs. So there's the legal leg. The legal leg. So in Hong Kong, you know, you have, it's legal, the legal institutionality, it's not the laws, it's not the words on the pieces of paper, it's who are the judges? Tell me about the courts. What's the judicial culture? Can I enforce a contract? Can I defend property rights? Can I execute a judgment? If I get into a dispute, can it be resolved in a business efficient way, or will it still be there for my grandchildren to deal with? And you say, hey, I'm not looking for that. I just want to pay less in taxes. So we eliminate that leg. Now we're down to a chair with one leg. That's a special economic zone. It's great. There are about 3,500 of them in the world. They are what they are. They're usually in a big improvement over what would otherwise be there. We have very realistic expectations of what they can or can't do. It's a place with low or zero tax. It's probably duty-free. It may have more flexible labor rules. Probably has less regulation. But if you think about it, imagine last year with the Free Market Roadshow with Barbara, we were in Macedonia, and going through, before getting there in the airport in Istanbul, I saw a big poster inviting people to invest in Macedonia, and it said 0 taxes. Now, if that's what it was entirely about, the obvious thing for Macedonia to do would be to send a mission to Switzerland, knock on the door of every company in Switzerland, and say it's completely irrational for you to be in Switzerland where you have to pay taxes. If you just come to Macedonia, 0 taxes. And every company would instantly abandon Switzerland and move to Macedonia, if it actually worked that way. But it doesn't work that way. It's not a chair with one legs. In fact, most productive capital in the world is actually in jurisdictions where it has to pay taxes. Not because capital is irrational, not because it's masochistic, but because what capital is looking for is that. It's looking for legal, economic, administrative, political jurisdictions that are attractive. In fact, my conclusion is there's only one thing that's actually scarce. Capital is not scarce. Technology is not scarce. Infrastructure is not scarce. Natural resources are not scarce. Human resources are not scarce. What's scarce are good jurisdictions. There are comparatively few good jurisdictions in the world. All of them are extremely rich and extremely expensive. You even have places that are simply rocks. You know, you have a place like Hong Kong or the Isle of Man. And why are the people there so rich? Well, because they're very good jurisdictions. They're very good jurisdictions. So Hong Kong is a legal, economic, administrative, political jurisdiction, a leap zone. It's about 3 times richer than Shenzhen, which is adjacent to it, which is just that, just a special economic zone. Now, in Honduras, we're using what we call institutional leapfrogging. That's where instead of copying institutions, we find institutions at work and we use them. That's what Lee Kuan Yew did with the British courts. The Emir of Dubai in 2006 wanted to create an international financial center. So what he did was say, in this international financial center, there'll be common law. He hired distinguished magistrates from Great Britain, New Zealand, and Singapore, and said, that's my Supreme Court. That's institutional leapfrogging through insourcing. That's what Hong Kong did post-97, post-handover. They still, at the appellate level, have foreign judges in Hong Kong in the judiciary. Now, this is our goal. We'd like to achieve the complete model. We know what actually works, and we want to get there. For 20 years, this is how I tried to help countries to get there, by doing economic reforms the way we all do them. Each of the forms individually is a big improvement and a very good idea. So we would go in there and we'd reform a pension system, or a monetary system, or we'd privatize a company, or concession a port, and these were good things. The unspoken idea was there are these 20 reforms that we need, and we'll do one reform every year for 20 years. At the end of 20 years, we reassemble the pieces and we have the Statue of David. It didn't quite work out that way. So it occurred to me to try and think, what if there were a different approach? What if we started with this? That's what Honduras is doing. That's the Honduran special zones. They're called sedes. It's tiny, but it's complete. What I like about this photograph is nothing's going to be added. The smallest toe already has a toenail. There are no body parts that we're going to add next year unless we lose the election. It's all there, and we know what it will become. It will grow, it'll become bigger, it'll become more complex, but we know what it is. It becomes that. That's what a leap zone does. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions or comments.
Thank you very much for a really fascinating talk. How do you contract it with the national government? I mean, because of course to have the old chair, I mean, you need to have, so to say, the autonomy and liberty to build it up. How did you convince the national government that you were not simply producing more economic activity in a free zone to pay more taxes, that you needed basically to have a different set of juridical institutions to begin with?
This is a project of the government of Honduras. The government of Honduras reformed the Constitution. They approved the organic law. Huge majorities, from left to right, government opposition voted in favor of it, because when you're solving a problem, I have one law or rule named after me, and it's this one. It's easier to produce a consensus about a problem than an agreement about a solution. There was a consensus about a problem that made it very easy when you were able to offer a solution that didn't force change on people who weren't looking for it. So the Constitution was changed through their procedures. The law was approved. To make it even more robust, a bilateral treaty was signed with Kuwait, and Honduras would be willing to sign treaties with other countries that want to do this. I don't know, does that answer your question, or was there more to your question than that?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense of the process that allow you to set up different zones. Let me put it this way. What's the bargain for the government? I mean, weren't they looking for any kind of immediate returns on this? And at the very same time, how can you be confident that they won't change the Constitution in 10 years when you have attracted businesses and capitals and intelligence?
Well, first of all, as we've observed, enclaves are extraordinarily durable. And as George Gilder pointed out when he was visiting Hong Kong 20 years ago, and someone said to him, well, yeah, Hong Kong is great now, but what will happen in 1997, which was the year that Hong Kong would be passed from the British to China? And Gilder said, 1997, that will be the year when Hong Kong takes over China. So the organic nature of these things actually is that the examples and the success of these zones is that they tend to grow rather than become precarious. In practical political terms, the people these are engines for generating jobs. And as Juan Manners was pointing out, a single company that employs just 5,000 people is a political fact that politicians are very sensitive to. So imagine the significance of a zone that could be producing 100,000 or 1 million or 2 million jobs. It simply is untouchable. These zones will be producing what we would call internal remittances. And we've had experiences in some of the Central American countries that the remittances that come from overseas workers, when there was one occasion before the national elections when members of the United States Congress said that if those bad people should win the election in that country, I don't know whether we would be able to continue these remittances. Instantly, the population turned the other way. That is, it's untouchable, it's unthinkable. That's how how resilient these things are. In addition, as I said, there's a treaty and there'll be other treaties, so it's a 50-year treaty. So it's not simply a matter of subject to internal discretion.
Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much.